Yay! I'm really excited to talk to you tonight, Kate, about some of the stuff that you've been working on. But first, maybe you could just introduce yourself. Last time you were on the show was about your avocado journal, so some people might know you from that. But maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and your nature journaling practice before we talk about your nature journal year in review.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me on the show, Marley. It's such a pleasure. I'm a big fan. And so this is awesome. My name is Kate Rutter. I live in the Oakland Bay Area, and my nature journal practice is pretty rambunctious. I have a personal practice. I also do education and help people learn about nature journaling and celebrate and explore and experiment. And I love it because it's really about that deep connection with nature. I mean, that sounds kind of like we all want that, but really that intimacy of observing phenomena and having a way to go back and reconnect with those moments and see our learning process and see my progression as I learn more about nature and as I appreciate it more. I think that's the core of my practice.
Cool. Okay, great. I love how you use the word rambunctious when you describe your nature journaling too. That's fun, and it's also consistent. You say that frequently. Maybe you could just unpack that a little bit. What does that mean to you, the rambunctious part of your practice?
Yes, I think it sounds better than unhinged or untethered, both of which are probably also true. So I get very excited about things and I process things visually a lot. I've been a sketcher most of my life. I've done it for business. I do it, I love taking abstract ideas and finding a way to make them visible. My favorite book as a kid was Harold and the Purple Crayon because he was drawing like his whole world. So that's been kind of core for me, but the reason I use rambunctious is because if there's a different approach or an experimentation, I kind of let go of the preciousness of the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love the energy of the process. I think every line that's translated through the human mind and hand has a truth to it. And so rather than having I mean, sometimes I do have a precise, high fidelity representational style. It's not my strong suit for sure. I'm much more of a rapid gestural sketcher,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have a lot of expectations for my own work, unless I'm doing client work, of course, because then we
Mm-hmm.
agree on expectations. But and I love to see what results from the flow of observation, attention, connection, expression, and then reflection afterwards.
Okay, great. Well, that's a perfect segue. The reflection part is a perfect segue into these reviews that you've been doing. And I think I saw a post on the Nature Journal Club Facebook page about the year end review that you did at the end of 2023. But it sounds like you're starting to do quarterly reviews as well. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you have been up to and sort of how that idea came to you.
Sure. I think it started with, it's the end of the year. We're in the Northern Hemisphere. We have a winter end of year. There's solstice. So there's all these transitions and kind of a shift in the end of a year. And I tend to get reflective, like many people. I've made, New Year's resolutions or revolutions or whatever. But what I hadn't ever done is kind of look back at my nature journaling practice in a more intentional way. uh, Probably similar to others in that we'll flip back through some pages or say, haven't I seen that phenomena or that leaf or that tree before? As we get to know these beings that become our friends and our community and our journals. But I'd never really done kind of a quantitative assessment of that, which is interesting because in my previous career in technology, quantitative work was pretty important.
Mm.
So it started with an insidious question like, did I journal more this year than last year? But I also know the first year you do any kind of quantified metrics or tracking, you don't know because you're actually setting your baseline year. So I'm
Mm.
like, well, if I want to know the answer to this question a year from now, I need to do some work right now. And that was really the insidious question. But then when I started the process, which turned out to be much more fun, a little more involved the first year. I'm trying to make it easier and I'll share some tips what I've learned. But It was so fun, and things I thought were happening in my journal, turns out the numbers decried that they were indeed not happening as much as my qualitative sense was
Yeah.
telling me. So they revealed kind of a whole different truth, and, I found that quite enchanting.
Great. Yeah, I'm gonna definitely ask you about more about that in a little bit. Maybe you could show some pages, for example, like of the 2023 review. I know it's up on your website for people to see. People are a visual audience here, so let's see the 20. Can you show us what this looks like? I love how you explain that making things visual makes them less abstract. So I think looking at a little bit would be really helpful. And I can put you
Sure.
on solo layout once you get that up.
Okay, I'm gonna hop over to a different
Okay.
camera. Can you see that, Marley?
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the end result. This is
Mhm.
certainly didn't come out of the chute. This is after quite a bit um, of iteration, right? But the result that happened was some simple data visualizations around attributes that it turned out I cared about. I went into
Mhm.
this process not knowing what I cared about, and I think that's important to recognize. We don't, unless you have a specific question that, like, did I journal more this year than last year? Then the first year is going to be an exploration of what questions you might have for the future. But I ended up with some numbers. I tried to make them a little bit more, jazzy because I wanted to look at this and enjoy looking at
Mhm.
it. So I'd use it. But it generally has like the number of journal entries that I did, and then locations, and then there's pie charts showing some percentages of
Mhm.
locations, who I was with when I did them, whether I was solo or with others. And then these are format. I didn't find that as interesting, but like percentage that was black and white as opposed to color. I'm heavily into the pen and ink, apparently. And then percentage that was in pen and pencil, which I was also surprised about because I really love pencil. I just apparently don't use it as much in my field journal. And then this was also a surprise. This is the number of journal entries per month. So I'd
Yeah.
really like this to be more flat, like up here and flat would be lovely. But this cracked me up because this is September and this is
Mhm.
the Wild Wonder Conference where
Mhm.
I was working a lot on Wild Wonder activities and taking notes and participating in the sessions, but I wasn't doing my field journals. So it
Mhm.
dropped dramatically. And then here, this is, I can talk about this if you're curious, but this was a spider graph of attributes that I ended up caring about to see
Mhm.
what was balanced with that. And what I really appreciated about this process is this is all the quant side. This comes from numbers that are countable and calculatable. And this is all the qualitative side. Like what
Right.
really stood out as a way of the moments of joy or the growth opportunities, like you talk about the growth, edge, and
Mhm.
then reflections and a little more of a poetic bent. So I think the two are really important to balance each other out because this you can just get to be bean counting. And there's
Mhm.
some caveats with counting things that change our behavior that can have some unexpected and undesirable results.
Interesting. It's really cool to look at, and even just the wait, let me pop myself back in here. Even just seeing the monthly one is crazy to think about, and it makes me so curious about what other people's graph would look like over the course of the year. Like it looks like yours. It looks like a northern hemisphere place where it's either rain or coldy, rainy or coldy for part of the year and less inspiring to nature journal. So, and then those big, I was noticing the spikes, and for some reason, I was thinking that the October, I was remembering incorrectly that I thought the Wild Wonder Conference was in October. So I thought your spike was big during Wild Wonder, but now I see why why it wasn't. Okay, so let's get into some more questions here. I guess the first one is to start with the question of why do something like this. And I think you hinted at it a little bit earlier, but why do you think it's important to do this type of reflection? Why is a nature journaling practice? How can it benefit from? How can we benefit from doing a reflection or review like this?
That's a good question. I'm a big believer in the three different lenses or languages, as they're called, the words, pictures, and numbers as means of observation. And what enchants me about those numbers, anytime I count something or I measure something or I look at time spans, um, is it reveals patterns that I can't just see through looking. And it's almost like, think about it as a sixth or seventh or eighth sense, right? Being
Mm,
able to count. And so that, I think the numbers reveal things that we can't see when we are just maybe doing a flip through or a browse through.
mm,
I do think, I mean, there's already kind of a bar chart um, culture or tradition with visual practitioners where they stack up all of the sketchbooks in a big stack and say, look at the year, right? I've seen a lot of social media posts like that. I think that's awesome and celebratory. I also think for folks who are just starting to practice, that can be a little daunting.
mm,
And so I really like the idea that you can choose other things to count that matter, and everything counts if you have your own kind of criteria for what matters to you. So you might count, the number of birds that show up in your journal, and you might have 10 entries, but you might have, 75 birds, and that's worth celebrating. So I really like the numbers, and I think they reveal patterns that are surprising. So it's this
mm.
sense of discovery.
Cool. Okay, so my next question then is, it seems like there's a lot of benefits of doing this. So why do you think more people aren't doing this? Or why does this feel like such a, when I saw it, I thought I'm really interested in like the Vanguard or like these like weird new things or like the edges of nature journaling or weird places where it overlaps with unrelated things, such as like puppetry. I don't know. But so like why do you think this feels like it's on that sort of edge of nature journaling and not like more common?
I was surprised by some of the enthusiasm around the post, because I've come from a world where the annual review or an annual report or an annual summary is a really common thing. And I'm sure there's other people doing this for their nature journal reviews. I mean, the end of the year is a kind of a review time. I'm not sure they're sharing it. Sometimes those numbers can be personal and they don't perhaps get shared. So maybe there's a whole, secret group of folks who are doing this solo, and just not sharing it. That's totally
Mhm.
possible. I also think, though, that the nature journal community is just getting big enough now to have a lot of really interesting, like, dance moves into adjacent areas, and then interpret them for is this meaningful for a nature journal practice? And if so, how? And to
Mhm.
do that, I think you just got to try out a bunch of things. Like, I think within your show, you try a lot of different things and you bring them into the community, and then members of the community can choose to pick them up or not. And they often, things go from the fringes and the edges, and then they move slowly to the center. So we've got a bigger community. There's going to be a lot of fringe edges and maybe a lot of fringe benefits.
Mhm. Cool. Okay, so let's dive into some of the basic questions that you asked, like when you did this. And so this is from your website, intelletto.com. It's .com, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so I don't know if you remember these, but what I have here that I copied and pasted from your website is that these were the basic questions you asked. How much did I nature journal last year? When and where did I nature journal most? What kind of content shows up on my pages? What patterns are there that I don't even know to wonder about? And then you said that the goal is to have a baseline for my practice to see what changes year over year. And you also said, I don't really care about the actual numbers. I do care about growth, trends, and patterns over time. Is there anything more you want to say about like the basic questions that you had going into this? And maybe other questions that other people might ask if they did a review like this?
Uh, those are the questions. I thought a lot about them when I was writing that entry. So I'm so glad you read that, because I probably couldn't articulate it again as well as I'd done there. But so some of the questions that I've had are like, What about, the percentage of posts that have birds or mammals or reptiles or
Mhm.
critters or ocean views? What kind of habitats and environments were you in? I actually tried to count that this year, but I ended up with enough struggle that I abandoned that in lieu
Mhm.
of just getting some good numbers that I knew I could trust. And I thought I could add complexity next year. Like I
Mhm.
didn't want to over complexify it for the first
Mhm.
year because then it wouldn't get done. And so those were, I think, the questions about the content,
Mhm.
even more so than the form, like pencil or pen, color. I found those to be much less interesting,
Mhm.
frankly, to explore than the actual phenomena and the content. And that's what people have been asking about, like how many things were on birding and how many things
Yeah.
were, different types of, questions that you were asking. And so I captured some of those in the review this year, but most of the content I'll blend in next year. It's like a croissant, you roll out the dough, you add some butter, you still have to chill it, and then you can add more butter and keep rolling.
Yeah, okay. Can you explain a little bit more the last of those 4 questions there was, "What patterns are there that I don't even know to wonder about?" Could you explain? We're gonna get a little bit into I have some more questions about unexpected insights, further along, but this idea of what patterns are there that I don't even know to wonder about, could you tell me a little bit more about, like, your thought behind that question?
Yeah, and to do that, I'm actually gonna talk a little bit about the process I used. Is that
Mhm.
good? So the first thing
Yeah,
was like,
let's go for it. That's the next thing to talk about anyway, so that's fine.
okay, good, because that's where these questions came up. So the
Okay.
first, like, hey, I wonder if I've journaled more this year than last year. How would I find that out? And so the first step was to gather together all of the journals. I don't only have a nature journal. I have a sketchbook. I have a couple. I did the big bump on the timing in October is actually Inktober, where I did a
Mm,
30-day project that was related, and I would categorize that as nature journaling because it was observational about seeds. And
mm,
so that really bumped up the numbers there. But I had to remember, like at first I forgot because it wasn't in my nature journal. So it
mhm,
can take a couple thoughtful, just a moment of reflection to figure out where's my work, right? Like that's the
mm,
first challenge. And then looking through it though, I wasn't able to capture the data and tally the data in one go. I had to
mhm,
do 2 reviews, and then I did a 3rd review and maybe a 4th just for accuracy because it was such a new process for me. And so I think going through that body of work for a year, um, surprised me by the pattern of the actual natural seasonal year
hmm,
and how commonly, like things at the beginning of the year that I could remember drawing but not knowing about, as I
mm,
had learned about those throughout the part of the year, then I would draw them more, but maybe like, for example, Buckeyes. I'm a big Buckeye fan, fully
mhm,
in love with them. And so I noticed at the beginning of the year when they were first doing their bud burst, but I followed those Buckeyes, the actual same trees throughout
mm,
the year. And by the end, they were friends, right? And
mhm.
I was able to just celebrate that the last seed nut that was hanging was actually a blossom that I had seen on a branch
Whoa,
bud burst. So
mhm,
I think it's things, so that's not really a quantitative pattern, but
mhm.
it was a qualitative pattern that I wasn't expecting. It's
Yeah,
like
I
when
saw
someone, it's like, how'd you all meet? It's like the first time you meet someone, you don't know how important they're going to be in your life. But then
yeah,
looking back at when you met them, like
yeah,
years later, that has a special kind of texture to it. And I
wow.
found going through the journals did that.
Yeah, I saw that Buckeyes were one of your, blossoms or what are the buds and
Yeah, the buds and blooms. Yep, it's over here. I'll pop that up. But so buds are projects that helped me grow this year, and then blooms are these really moments of just scintillating, joyous, celebratory love that comes rushing forth. And so, yeah, there were definitely some things on that.
got it. Okay. So, my next thing, I have more questions about your process, but I was curious about this thing where you said that you care about growth, trends, and patterns over time. And maybe your thing about the Buckeyes answers this to some degree. But why do you think it's important to care about, or why do you care about growth trends and patterns over time?
Yeah, I don't I think it's a choice to care about growth, right? Like, there's a lot to be said about having a nature journal practice that you do and love it and enjoy it, and you don't have to be always striving or working or pushing or, trying
Hmm.
to hustle. Like, I'm a big fan of that, like, just do it as you love it.
Hmm.
I hear a lot of folks, and I also enter growth phases for myself where I want to do something a little different. I want to expand a skill set, or I want to understand a phenomena more deeply. I want to answer some of the questions that I end up asking in the pages.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have a way of tracking that growth. We talk about in an instructive kind of way the feedback in a nature journaling circle, and there's some really good insights and guidelines that John Muir Laws shares about that, and many people who are doing nature journal facilitation share about that. Like, don't only celebrate the pretty picture, make sure that people have a chance to talk about their work. There's some things, and using the I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of specifically around feedback.
Yep.
And we do that on the page level, but we don't really, I've not seen it on kind of a body of work level.
Hmm.
And that's what this annual review allowed for me, was to take, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and kind of bump it up to a much longer time span with more data points and some more interesting, I thought, trends for, is my work changing? Maybe I
Hmm.
don't even want to say, is it getting better? I think that already you have to define what better means for you. But is it changing? And if so, how? And is that something that I'd like to direct a little bit more? Or is that something I just want to let go a little feral?
Hmm. Yeah. See, I think that's the stuff that made me so interested in this. Is I think that we always talk about how nature journaling is such a powerful tool, and we're like pointing it at all of these things in nature, but then it's like, yo, why don't we like point that at ourselves and like our own process? It feels very like meta or something, but like take the nature journaling tools and point them at our own nature journaling process and nature journal ourselves. And like, if it's such a great tool for like learning and noticing patterns, then yeah. So I think that's part of why I was so excited to talk to you about this. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about your process, such as, I know on your website you said how long it took. Maybe you could talk about like how long it took and what was the hardest part.
Great question. And actually, what you just said earlier reminds me, I think this is a really interesting case of using the approach of zoom in, zoom out. Like, this
Mm,
is a zoom out
yeah,
kind of
exactly.
consideration. So I like spreadsheets, and so I started making notes about things. And I know you're not going to be able to read a lot of this data, but I want to show you what the tallies kind of look
Okay.
like, because they were messy. I have multiple books. Go over here. See if it's just, there we go. I have multiple sketchbooks, and I had that
Whoa.
Inktober thing. So this this is like the third version, and it's a pre-tally. And I was actually doing this sometime in December, because I
Oh,
was trying to get ahead of the game. Turns out that was less helpful than I expected, because then I had to calculate everything again after the
oh
end of the
no.
year. But I wrote down, what nature journal it was and what month it was. And then I had gone through and tallied. Let me show the actual kind of tally sheet. The tallies, this is a test, kind of looked like this, where I wrote down the month and where the location was, and then I tallied the number of entries. And then I also and that was the first review. And then the second review was the number of sessions, was it an event, all of the things that ended up in that summary, those summary colors on the result. I had tally marks for this.
Wow.
And so that's, you want to be in a place where you can kind of concentrate and have some quiet time and not be interrupted, for sure. But that core tally was really meaningful and instructive. You can see how many times I had to correct it, because that was numbers and counting is hard for me. So that was the first thing. So it was just like getting the tallies down, was both fun, but it was its own deal. So I think that is helpful. Having the categories that I wanted to count. I didn't know what categories I wanted to count. But things that showed up for me were the metadata, were entries with words, pictures, and numbers, all
Mhm.
three on them, because I usually do words and pictures, and sometimes I do numbers, but those were things I was curious about on the number of questions. So having the criteria, so when I went through and did the tally, I didn't have to go back multiple times. Like that's a tip that I'd offer is have at least your criteria. And that's why I think the two pass approach is so important. The first one, you definitely know what the date is, what session it was. So let's say you go nature journaling in the morning on a walk, and let's say you do an evening at a sit spot. I would consider those two different sessions.
Mhm.
You can define that session however you want, but I found sessions was more meaningful just than days.
Mm.
I also had to define what a nature journal entry was, and it
Mm.
changed my language probably forever. I often talk about pages. Sometimes there's spreads, but humans are ragged, and it turns out there might have been two different chunks from two different days, different sessions on the same
Right.
page. How do I count that? So I started using terms of journal entries. And that way, sometimes an entry could be multiple pages if it
Yeah.
was one long, like a tour or something, a walking tour I was on. So having some of that terminology was something that surprised me. I'm actually writing some of this up for a little bit more of maybe a downloadable package to save some people from honestly the pain in the butt stuff that I had to deal with. And of course, only as a launching point for personalization, customization, and adaptation. But
Mhm.
yeah, so that first pass of just the counts helps highlight and like opened up my eyes for what kind of content oriented stuff did I think would be helpful to count. And that's
Mhm.
the insights around like metadata and even the format of like pencil or pen, the number of sessions or entries with questions, like that second level of detail, which is really where the fun visualizations are, had to come through the second pass. Otherwise, it was just too hard to count.
Mm. So what was the actual hardest part? Was doing that first pass the hardest part or coming up with the categories?
The most annoying part was doing that first pass because anytime I changed a category, like I started with
Mm.
pages and I did a bunch of counts, and then I'm like, I hit the first, like kind of near the end of the year, I hit the first challenge with pages
Mhm.
as the unit of measure. Then I had to go back and recount everything, right? Because I hadn't had that kind of mental awareness of what was an entry versus what was a page. And I think in any metrics practice, and you just have to jump in on this because I will go crazy because I love metrics so much because I think they're a different mirror for
Mhm.
human behavior or for activities. Um, but the part of metrics that's really crucial is you want to have some precision in the definitions of what these numbers or what these categories of numbers mean. And
Yeah.
that way, when you start calculating them and getting the richness of the things that you can put into a data visualization,
Mhm.
then you kind of know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like entry and pages are not the same thing, and that's a
Mhm.
helpful delimiter.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay, so you hinted at these templates potentially that could be coming out. Do you have any suggestions for people who want to try this? You've dropped a few here and there, but do you have any suggestions? And can you say anything about the templates?
Yeah, I think the suggestions are if this does not excite you, don't do it. Like it is not important, right? It's important if it's important to you. So don't feel any pressure. If you have a wee bit of curiosity, then I say step into it simply. Like do entries and maybe sessions and locations, because those three give you a lot of gave me a really good lens on kind of the overall health and welfare of my practice as a habit that's consistent and ongoing, which I care about. Um, if you really geek out on this, then I would say it's helpful to spend a little bit of time defining what you think you might want to count. And don't be surprised. This is the real like, oh, kind of moment. That when we observe our own behavior and we count things, that it changes our behavior.
Mhm.
there's a whole purpose of metrics. It's the whole purpose is to actually affect some kind of outcome or change the behavior. And so that's what I'm finding this year. I'm not doing it for the numbers. Like I'm not trying to game the system for more numbers, but
Mhm.
what I am much more attuned to is that metadata matters to me.
Hmm.
And I'm more aware that I wasn't consistent last year, as consistent as I thought I was. And so now I'm more aware of that, and now I am more consistent.
Mhm.
So I think that's helpful. The other thing is because I'd like to do more content, I'm going to do a quarterly review, and then
Mhm.
I'll have some of these interim numbers so that I can not have a big lift at the end of the year.
Mhm.
So I think
Mhm.
deciding on what categories or criteria might matter to you.
Mhm.
And then finding a way to maybe do it half the way through or an interim part of the year so you don't have this big lift. And then be surprised at what you'll learn that was kind of hidden from you before.
Cool. I've noticed for me, like going back to the metadata thing, I've noticed that I don't do a review thing like this, but I have been trying to do indexing, and I also so that requires me to go back through and I do a lot of times, like I'll put the date range on the front page of the journal and show like, it was from this date to this date. And when I do those two things, um, it forces me to do a sort of review of previous pages. And I have noticed it's annoying when I don't have metadata because I know sometimes I like jump into like I get somewhere and there's crazy stuff happening already, or there's like monkeys jumping out of the trees or whatever. And then I just start journaling right away. And then later on, I never put the metadata. And so then when I get to the end of the journal and I go back and I realize, oh shoot, I don't know where that was or when it was. And that's definitely something that I've noticed from looking back at my journals.
That's a really key insight. That's it. I was surprised how much I had to rely on my calendar. I'm like,
Mm,
was that a I know it was a different day, but which day was it? And if
yeah.
let's be honest, some folks are going to have there's going to be a wide variability in the number of entries that we're
Hmm.
talking about here. So if you've got 5 for a year, that's
Hmm.
fabulous. Like,
Hmm.
that's great. There's richness in there. And if
Hmm.
you have, 1,000, then you might track less detailed data and just look at kind of the bigger, broader patterns. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's an investment, but like an index. I mean, indexing is anytime you do a show on indexing, I kind of just drool just a little bit because it's so beautiful to have the data about the data and to show those broader patterns.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for that compliment on indexes. All right. Let's go into unexpected insights. Do you think that most people would have unexpected insights if they did a review, like, for example, of what types of nature journaling approaches or something like that, if they track something like that?
Hmm. Well, I can't see inside the hearts and minds of others, so I'm not going to be able to make any kind of prediction, but I would just say to that, I hope so.
Okay.
I hope that going back to our nature work and our nature journals um, continues to unfold the mysteries that excited us when we were actually making that work. I would hope
And
there's
so,
more just within the work.
okay, I guess another question then is why do you think unexpected insights are interesting or important, if at
Hmm.
all?
If at all, there's that Marley additive
Right.
opens up a whole world. I don't know that they are. I know they are to me. They're like the little pops of carbonation in drinking water, right? Like just this
Mhm.
moment of delight or wow or I don't know. It's almost a touch of the divine. And I
Mhm.
think that the touch of the divine that brings us feeling more connected to ourselves, each other, etc., is part of the joy of being out in nature and in a place and feeling a part of it. And
Mhm.
that like those little moments of wonder and curiosity and like what is that? Like those pop points, that's what I think excited me when I realized there were some patterns in the data.
Got it.
And it made
Okay.
no sense, but I still like, I don't know, it's emotional. It's like,
Mhm. All right. So in your year-end review thing, you have this sentence where you use the term inner evidence, and it's in relationship to unexpected insights because you mentioned that your review process showed that information didn't about like how you were nature journaling and what type of nature journaling and stuff like that didn't match your inner evidence. Could you explain more like what you meant by that and why that matters?
yes, this one came up with questions because I like questions. It turns out I don't write down nearly as many questions as I thought I did. Because I'm curious and questioning during the sessions. Like when I'm out in nature, I'm constantly asking questions. But it turns out I only ask those questions in my head and I write down my observations and my enthusiasms, probably. That's what shows up on the page. And so, as you talk so eloquently, if we don't, the things that don't end up on the page are still kind of floating around in our heads, and they sometimes don't get the objective attention that they need.
Mhm.
So they get missed. And so I was saddened a little by not having as many questions and that actually showed up on the page. But my inner compass said, "Oh yeah, sure, you ask questions all the time." And I think because we talk in the nature journal community a lot about questions and asking questions and getting curious, I almost wonder if there's not like an exposure bias
Mhm,
that
mhm.
I hear about it so often. Of course, if you know, if nature journalers ask question, and if I'm a nature journaler, I will ask questions. Turns out the data says that's not true.
Yeah, well, I think that's really amazing that you were the guinea pig and that did this to yourself because I think in some ways I think that's part of the um and maybe this comes up like in the business world when people have like a year end review or something that's like on their performance or whatever is that there's a level of vulnerability in this because you're kind of almost in a way like measuring yourself, and I think that that can be sort of scary for people. And I think just with this questions example, it feels very like exciting, but it also does feel like it could be something where we might put up barriers to help us not feel like uncomfortable or feel like we're being measured or judged, but that might not always actually be in our best interest in terms of like learning or growing or even just being honest. Like I think for example, with this example, I probably do the same thing. Like if I checked how often I'm asking questions or doing certain things that I think I am doing or I tell other people I'm doing, if I actually measure it and find out that I'm not doing that, that's very interesting information. It's also kind of sensitive. And so I think sometimes unconsciously we might be protecting ourselves from something like that and coming up with other reasons why we don't um, apply like these objective and observant nature journaling lenses to ourselves because we're afraid that we might see things that we don't want to see.
Mm, that's important and part of this too. Um, you mentioned in being more of a in an employment review capacity, and and I recall from working with previous clients in the technology world that the baseline was really hard. The trying to get together. First of all, the technical elements of measuring things can be hard, right? Just getting the data, but having a baseline shows you a different truth, and it's so much easier not to want to see that truth and to work with anecdotal evidence or
Mhm.
anecdotal stories. And if there's a lot at stake, the truth can be hard, right? So I guess my response is, how do we not have such high stakes? Like,
Mm.
if like I learned that I didn't ask as many questions as I thought I was. That was helpful information for me. But guess what? I don't have to put a lot of pressure on myself and say, okay, I'm going to go nature journal. I got to ask some freaking questions. I can just decide I didn't ask questions in my journal. If they
Mhm.
show up, great. I thought
Mhm.
they showed up more. They don't show up as more. Now I have an intentional choice I can make about my practice. And I don't have to feel bad when everybody talks about how great questions are. I just know that's not my jam.
Mhm.
And so in some ways, it gave me more decisions perhaps to make, which sounds hard, but it also made me more confident with the decisions that I had made, I
Mhm.
was gonna make, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm probably not gonna do a ton of color in the field. I don't expect that percentage of color to black and white to change dramatically. I don't
Mhm.
want it to. I don't necessarily think it needs to. If it does, meh, that'd be trivia, not insight.
Mhm. Okay. So you mentioned this a little bit before, but I still want to ask again, how do you think that this process has changed your nature journaling practice, like when you're out there and in the moment?
Like you, I'm a lot more attentive of writing down the metadata.
Okay.
It just that was so funny. I was like, I should probably do that," because it helps me in so many ways and kinda gets me settled into the session anyway. I
Uh-huh.
think that was a big change. I think the next is, uh, gosh, I had some things that I was pretty sure would change, but now I'm into the year by a month, and it turns out they're not changing specifically. So, I don't know. I think I'm more curious about, um, not having gaps or
Uh-huh.
more interested in not having gaps, and, like, you saw that, you can see on the monthly chart, I would like this to be a
Right.
smooth line instead of quite so jaggy.
Mhm.
And to
Yeah.
me, the meaning of that is the shape of this pattern is indicative to me that I am more consistent in my practice. And
Yeah.
rambunctious, consistent don't always go together. So consistency is not really my jam. But I love this practice and it keeps me so much more stable and calm and in love with the world and learning and sharing. I want more of that. I want to be more like that. So this, going from peaks and valleys to a good solid plateau is, I think, gonna help my health, my care, my facilitation, and support of others in the community when I do, education work, etcetera. I think it's just a big win.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great one to track. I might try to figure out a way if I can track that one. Okay, so I have a couple other questions here about sort of how a journal can work for noticing these bigger picture patterns instead of just being sort of this chronological, like each page is its own separate thing. Do you? I guess one of my questions here is about. Um, do you think like there are other ways to do similar to use a nature journaling practice? Do you think there's other ways in addition to doing like a review that can give you some like bigger picture patterns about your practice, or kind of like going back to your zoom in, zoom out thing? Are there other nature journaling practices or related practices we can do to zoom out from our practice?
Sure, I think perpetual journals is an example of that kind of, the measures over time.
Hmm.
Because it in its own way, so a perpetual journal has, you decide, I guess, on a number of years it will take, and then either daily or mostly weekly, there's an entry for that week of the year, and then you go back that next year and you put it on that same, like, week 1 of the year page. And so over 5 years, you'll have 1 page representing 1 week, the same week of the year over a 5-year span. And
Yeah.
these, climate and seasonal and kind of more, broader time spans,
Mhm.
I think they have a different sense of pattern. I think that
Yeah.
is its own way of measurement, through time. I'm
Yeah.
also curious about people that do diagrams and data visualizations. Akshay Mahajan does a
Mhm.
lot of that on his pages, and I think actually measuring the phenomena is its own way to kind of measure things. So,
Mhm.
uh, and there's patterns across that. So if you're doing the same, say, bird counts and flock counts, and you do that on an annual seasonal basis because maybe you're in a flyway with a migration path, then looking back across those time spans, I think that's interesting too.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I'm curious for you, actually, Marley, how, if you've had situations where you've gone back, like maybe to the way back of your nature journal practice to try and identify a through line of a phenomena or a being or a technique or something where you've looked way back and kind of indexed it topically instead of chronologically?
Not really. It's a little bit hard. Like, I think the closest I came, like sometimes I randomly will. I used to for a long time. I used to where I lived. I had all of my journals like on a bookshelf behind me, so it would be more common then for me to like pull one out sort of randomly and look through it. Then about maybe 4 years ago, I did a live show on my YouTube channel where I went through. It ended up being 5 hours long, and I went through all of my journals, and I didn't index them, but like I put numbers on all of them so that at least, because I was getting to a stage where it was really hard to find anything. And I probably had about 40 at that time. And it was really hard to find anything. So I spent 5 hours, and it was a live show, and I went through every journal, and I like ordered them chronologically on my shelf, put numbers on them, and then put like a date range, and wrote on the front cover like a couple of the main places or main things that were in that journal. And that was sort of the closest thing I've done to kind of looking through a lot of them. Now it's a lot harder because some of them are like in Jack's attic in San Mateo, and some of them are like stored at my mom's house. And I think I have like 5 or 6 with me now. So they're kind of like the journals themselves are all over the place. So that makes it a little bit harder, but I think it would be really cool to try to do something like that. But it is a little bit daunting, like logistically. And I think I would definitely need like a lot of space and time to kind of to lay everything out. And I think it could be pretty fun though.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that because, yeah, I mean, indexing, if you have something in the computer already part of the machine, and indexing
Mhm.
the tools are so much better. But when you're really looking at indexing, and that's what this is, it's information architecture work in so many ways. But it's indexing by tags, by metadata, by topic, by date. Like there's a set of data elements that are related to all of our pages. And the question
Mhm.
is, we're going to geek out about it. Can we make the most of it? And what's the smallest, simplest way that we can gain insight out of kind of the patterns across our work, um, so that we can use them or be surprised by them or decide they don't matter, whatever purpose we want. But I think
Yeah,
there's hidden gold there.
I think it's a very interesting thing because I think that the journaling, and I think this is something that people who've worked with books have come up against for millennia, is that and it's very different from like what we have now with digital stuff, but like at a certain point, these having your ideas or other people's ideas and information and questions and whatnot on paper is extremely useful, and it has like all of these applications because it's like externalized thinking. But then there's like logistical barriers to how to organize that information. And like librarians have been dealing with this for thousands of years. And I think that nature journaling, especially as you build up like a larger body of journals, there's so many ways that that resource can be used. Like a lot of times we talk so much about like how nature journaling can make you more present and how it can improve your observation skills. And even if you burned all your journals, like as soon as you finish them, you would still be having a lot of benefits. And a lot of us really focus on that. But there are all these benefits of having that like body of information. But I think there's all these logistical barriers, or maybe we don't have enough tools to take full advantage of that like massive resource that we have. So I think that's part of why this feels so exciting.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah, definitely possibilities there.
yeah, my last question last sort of big question here that I wanted to ask you is maybe you could talk a little bit about. I think your year-end review does a really good job of showing this qualitative and quantitative, and you've mentioned those terms like multiple times. Maybe you could just unpack, like, for people who aren't that don't throw those words around quite as much as you do, like what they mean to you, how you would sort of define them, and how to like balance those, and how might understanding the difference between those two help other people in approaching a year-end review.
That's a good question. True. I'll kind of keep this nature journally focused, but
Mhm.
quantitative is the language of numbers. Qualitative is the language of stories, generally. They don't have to be either or, but they do have specific attributes. If you're thinking about a spectra or a spectrum where qualitative might be on one edge and quantitative on the other. So if you are counting things and using a language of numbers, then that's going to be a quantitative truth or a quantitative evidence. Qualitative tends to be more human, more subjective, and it carries in language and stories.
Mhm.
So the other thing is quantitative data, when you're like looking at measuring behavior or activities or evidence, will tell you what's happening. Like it'll tell you what is happening, but it won't ever tell you why. And
Mhm.
qualitative will tell you why. So
Mhm.
let's say someone is going out. Let's say I'm going out and I'm going to nature journal, 20 times this week. Well, if I have a goal of nature journaling 20 times this week and I go out 10 times, then the quant says 50% of the time of my goal, I made 50% of my goal.
Mhm.
I actually have evidence of a behavior that was quantifiable at going out and having 10 nature journal sessions. That's something
Mhm.
someone watching me could observe, right?
Mhm.
And then, but it will never say why I
Yeah.
did or why I didn't. Those you have to talk to me. And I
Mhm.
probably have to think back about what the week was like and
Mhm.
do some exploration and reflection. So I
Mhm.
think both of those are sources of truth that are really meaningful and powerful, certainly to me. And if it's all qualitative, then I kind of want a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more ballast to it. I want some numbers that I could understand and kind of have faith in a different kind of evidence. And if it's all quantitative, then I think it can suck the life out of it.
Mhm.
So, because why care? So I think balancing both of those. So when I was thinking about this, I wanted to see the data. I wanted to see what questions not only the data answered, but also what the data new questions for me to ask. And then I wanted the year review to include what really, really matters to me, which is
Mhm.
the connection and the miracle and the hilarity of seeing these beautiful, amazing natural phenomena kind of emerge. And, you know, being able to feel good about where I challenged myself, or remembering that I challenged myself and that there are things that I ended the year with that I didn't have or hadn't experienced or explored at the beginning of the year,
Mhm.
and keeping that growth edge because that mattered to me too. So I think
Mhm.
having both of those, and I kind of like that they're both on two different sides of the page, like they make the whole thing is necessary for it to be workable for me.
Yeah. So let me throw an idea past you. Like, so if someone were potentially like intimidated by the numbers part, could you have a sort of year-end review practice that basically looked like, okay, on New Year's Day, I like take all of my journals and sketchbooks from that year, and I just kind of give myself a couple hours. I make a cup of like hot chocolate or whatever. I go through all of them, just kind of randomly kind of flipping through, looking at stuff. And then I do sort of like a blossoms and blooms and buds page, and just like sort of write down 5 of the things that were like the most meaningful nature journal outings. Maybe write down a couple questions and make like a haiku to describe my year. Could a year end review process look like that?
Oh, heck yeah. Absolutely. For sure. Yeah.
Cool. How about to end, could you read if it feels okay, would you read your haiku, year end review haiku?
Of course. Yeah, I don't have a lot of poetry in my journals. So this one says haiku: pages mark a year, love letters in line and song, buds and blooms abound.
Yay, that is so cool. Well, Kate, thank you for making time to be on the show. If people want to like see more of your nature journaling work or like your educational offerings in the Bay Area, where is the best place to point people to?
I think right now my Instagram, I'm at Kate Rutter. There is also, I'd say, keep an eye maybe on intelletto.com, which is my personal little corner of the internets. It hasn't gotten as much love in the last year as I hope to bring to it this year. So if it doesn't look very active, I'd say everything current is really happening on Instagram right now. And yeah, but keep an eye on Intelletto, or if you have questions, there's a contact form on Intelletto, and I'm good to respond to
And
those.
it's with two L's, right?
It is. It is an
Okay.
Italian word that was attributed to Michelangelo about the inherent intelligence in art. Kind of goes along with that concept that the sculpture is in the stone, and the practitioner or artist's role is to remove all the excess. It's
Mhm.
like that there is a strength and essence in art that's intelligent and thoughtful, and our job is to help discover it. So that's where that word comes from.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out the website because you put a lot of work into. I know some of the stuff when I've looked on there before, like when you post stuff from your Wild Wonder conferences, I'm like, wow, this is super well organized. And yeah, and you have a whole thing about your year-end review there that people can check out. So thanks for sharing, and thanks for all of the amazing work you're doing on pushing the growth edge of nature journaling.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be on the show, Marley. Thanks.
Great. All right. Bye, everybody.